Okay, so last week we got to talk about chapters 1 and 2 of 2nd Nephi. Well, this week we get to jump into chapters 3, 4, and 5, where we get to talk even more about some of the words that Lehi leaves to his sons before he dies. But we also get to talk about what happens after he dies. So from everything that, we've heard from Laman and Lemuel thus far, the way that they react isn't super surprising. But there are some surprising things that happen along the way and some amazing lessons for us to learn in our lives. So let's go ahead and jump into chapter 3. So in this chapter, Lehi talks to his son, Joseph, and that's his last-born son. So that's his youngest. And then he kind of talks about the land, how the land's going to be consecrated and stuff like that. But then he actually starts talking about Joseph back in Egypt, the one that we read about in the Bible, whose brothers sold him into slavery. Like, I'm sure you've heard this story before. So Lehi starts talking about him and about how Joseph actually saw the Nephites. I need to do some more research to find out the answer to this. I don't fully understand how Lehi would know that. I imagine, okay, so here's what I would think from this, because in my head I'm like, how could Lehi have known that Joseph knew about him? Like, you get what I'm saying? But the thing that I'm thinking about is, how much do you want to bet that all of those writings about Joseph are in the brass plates? So he has all the things that Joseph wrote. And so because he has all of that, he's able to read about things that Joseph saw, right? And I think that because he has those writings, he's able, how do I want to word this? I think Lehi is able to understand that Joseph did know about them. That makes sense. But here's the thing, is that we don't hear in the Bible about this. We don't hear about the Nephites in the Bible. Like, we don't hear Joseph talking about them. But I think that's just because that got left out when the Bible was translated. So I think that's like where some confusion comes from. So like I said, I don't fully understand this. I know this doesn't make a whole lot of sense, so don't quote me on this, but that's sort of just what comes to my head in trying to understand this. So so we talk about Joseph for quite a bit. And then we actually start talking about Moses. And here's where I really want to talk. So let's jump to verses 17. And in this verse it says, "And the Lord hath said, I will raise up a Moses, and I will give power unto him in a rod, and I will give judgment unto him in writing. Yet I will not loose his tongue, that he shall speak much, for I will not make him mighty in speaking. But I will write unto him my law by the finger of mine own hand, and I will make a spokesperson for him." I love this verse. I love this verse so much, because what this says to me is that God sent Moses, and he had a work for Moses to do, but he wasn't going to give Moses the ability to speak very well. Like, Moses had a very hard time speaking, and it made him kind of question why God sent him. He was like, "God, why are you having me do this? Like, I can't speak very well." And God was like, "Listen, I don't need you to speak well. I will take care of that. But you have a different set of talents that I need from you." And so I love this because it says you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to have all these abilities in order to fulfill God's work that he has for you. You don't need to be able to do all of these things in order to serve God and be helpful in his plan. But here's another thing that I thought about, was that it talks about how the way that this is worded, it says I will not make him mighty in speaking. And the way that this is worded, it says to me that God is saying, hey, I could have given you the ability to speak, because I have control over talents you do and do not have. I could have very well made you so that you could speak very well, that you could write very well, that you were just like great at everything, but I didn't do that. And there's a reason for that. And this can be such a great lesson to us. I know personally in my life, like, I'll go to youth and stuff like that. Like, I'll go to Wednesday night activities, and, you know, if we play, like, a sport or something with the young men, like, for a combined activity, I am not a super, super sporty person. Like, if I understand the concept of the game, I can play somewhat decently. But there's a reason why I do not play competitive sports. Like, I am a theater kid, 100%. I'm not a sporty person, and I'm okay with that. But sometimes I'm second guess myself, and I'm kind of like, all of these guys, and even like a bunch of like the young women too, like, they're so much better at the sport than I am, and it sometimes like makes me feel not that great about myself. But then I have this thought, and I'm like, okay, but if you were to take these same kids and put them on a stage, and you were trying to get them to sing and to dance and to act like what I do, they probably wouldn't be that great. They wouldn't understand a lot of the lingo. They wouldn't understand things that I say to them. But I would. If you were to put me on a stage, I would shine, because that is the environment that I am great in. I am amazing. Like, I don't know. Does that make sense? Where, like, listen, I might not be really, really great at sports, but I'm really, really great at theater. That is where I shine. God did not make it so that I could be great at everything. He gave me individual talents so that I could help certain people with those talents that he gave me. And it's the same thing here with Moses. He did not need Moses to be great at everything, but he needed him to be great at writing, because he needed him to write the words on the brass plates so that way we could get the Bible. And so that was incredibly important to him. So if you're ever feeling like you're not good at something, just remember that there is something you are good at. There is something, like, there's a talent that you have that a lot of other people might not have. And that is incredibly important to you and your individual plan and what God needs you to do in your life. And that is why I love this verse so, so much. So I actually want to go back to verse 15, because I accidentally skipped over this, but it talks in verse 15 about how there's going to be someone later down the road that will be called to be a seer, and will be called to do these things, right? And so it's talking about Joseph Smith. I'm not gonna get into exactly what it's talking about, but basically it's talking about Joseph Smith in verses 14 and 15. And so in verse 15 it says, "And his name shall be called after me." So Joseph, obviously, because we're talking about Joseph, this is from Joseph. "And it shall be after the name of his father. And he shall be like unto me, for the thing which the Lord shall bring forth by his hand, by the power of the Lord shall bring my people unto salvation." The Book of Mormon. And so I had this thought when I was reading this. And I was like, okay, so this is talking about Joseph Smith, right? You can sort of figure out this is talking about Joseph Smith. But here's the thing. Joseph Smith was the one that had to translate this off of the gold plates and into the Book of Mormon. So it makes me wonder, was he sitting at that table with whoever was translating with him, and is reading this stuff, and then he stops and he's like, wait, this is talking about me? I would die laughing, because that's so funny to me that it's you're in the middle of doing this work that God has called you to do, and you come to find out that he has planned for you to do this for hundreds of thousands of years. And so it's kind of funny. But on the flip side, that's really incredibly cool, because you can apply that to your life too. Okay, no, there probably hasn't been a prophet that has prophesied about you and has talked about you in some form of scripture. But God has prepared a plan for you. For hundreds of thousands of years, he has known exactly where you're supposed to be, what time you're supposed to be in, what you're supposed to do, and how you're supposed to help him in his plan. And I just love that thought that every single thing we do, God needs us to do. That is a part of his plan for us. And it's really, really cool to me. So then I want to hop into verse 19 real quick, and at the very end it says, "For I know their faith." And I just had this thought, and I wrote down my scriptures, and it says, he knows us. He knows our hearts. He knows our faith, and he knows whether or not we're trying. And I had this other thought. I was talking in seminary, and my friend talked about how the missionaries were talking to her about how faith is an action word. And it's not like you can just say, oh, I have faith, and then, like, that's that. But it's an action word. It is something that you have to continually live by. It is something that you have to show. It is something you have to do. And so I love this thought right here where it just says, for I know their faith. And he knows us. He knows, like, how do I want to explain this? So I explained this to my friend one time, and I told her, I was like, in my head, when we get to heaven, it's not going to be this scale where our good needs to outweigh our bad. Because if God was going to weigh our good versus our bad would probably win. Let's be honest. We're gonna do more bad things than we probably are good. Like, that's just gonna happen. But I think God is going to judge us based off of the intent of our heart. Did we actually try to change? Did we actually try to do good things while we were here? And I think that is what's going to determine whether or not we get into the celestial kingdom and where we want to go, and if we get to live with God for the rest of our lives. But yeah, I just wanted to point that out right there because I love that right there, what that says. Okay, so now we're going to jump into chapter 4. And Lehi continues to counsel with his children, except now he's sort of talking to his grandchildren. And specifically, he talks to the children of Laman and Lemuel. And I love these verses so much. It's sort of like 5 and 6, I think, is kind of where this falls. Not entirely sure, but Lehi basically talks to them and he says, okay, listen, I'm going to bless you. Because if I don't, you're probably going to, you're going to be cursed. But the thing is, it's not going to be your fault. The reason that everything that's going to happen after I die is going to happen is because of your parents' choices. Because Laman and Lemuel chose wicked things, and they chose to live a wicked life. That led to their kids being in that exact same boat. But it wasn't their fault. Their kids didn't always choose those things. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure they still did stupid stuff like every other kid. But imagine how much differently their lives would have been if they could have lived with Nephi, if they could have been Nephi's kids. They would have lived a completely different life. And so Lehi says to them, listen, these things, the things that have happened, those are going to be, your parents are going to have to answer for those things. You will not. You will answer for your wicked things that you have done in your life, and only those. And there are certain wicked things that you have done because of your parents' wickedness that could not, okay, I feel like this isn't making sense. What I'm trying to say is that, darn, it left my head. It reminds me of, I want to say it's the second article of faith, where it talks about how we are only responsible for our sins, and we're not responsible for the sins of Adam and Eve, right? And it's the same thing here, where they're not going to be responsible for the sins of their parents. But because they lived a life and they had the lifestyle of that wickedness, and that's all they knew. Because here's the thing, they never knew better. They never really had anyone. Later in the next chapter it talks about, or actually maybe it's this chapter. Is it this chapter or the next chapter? It's the next chapter. So in chapter 5 it talks about how the Nephites separate themselves from the Lamanites. So for most of these kids' lives, and for future generations, they never had a chance to be around goodness. They never had that in their life. And so here's a good way to explain it. It reminds me of when Jesus was on the cross and he said, forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. It's the same thing here. Lehi is saying, I'm going to bless you because you're going to do things in your life simply because you do not know better. And so I just love how he talks to them like that. And so in verse 6, I actually wrote down this note, and I wrote, I said, it's like he's saying to them, I don't want you to be cursed because of your parents' actions, so I'm going to bless you instead. So, anyway. All right, now I want to jump into verses like 15 through 20. And I love these verses right here because this is after Lehi has died. So Lehi talks to the sons of Laman and Lemuel about that, right? And then right after that, he dies. So then naturally, like, we know Laman, Lemuel, those guys, they rebel. Like, they're angry naturally, which, I mean, I get it. Like, after everything you've gone through, now your father is dead, like, I get it. But let us compare to how Nephi responded. Okay, and there's two things that I want to point out in these verses. So the first thing that I want to talk about is that where Laman and Lemuel were angry, Nephi talks about how his soul delights in the scriptures. This is in verse 15 where it says, for my soul delighteth in the scriptures, and my heart pondereth them, and writeth them for the learning and the profit of my children. Behold, my soul delighteth in the things of the Lord, and my heart pondereth them continually upon the things which I have seen and heard. So, well, his brothers are murmuring, and they're upset, and they're angry, which they have every right to be, honestly. Like, I think Nephi was probably still very upset. I mean, his father just died. Like, naturally, he's going to be upset. But instead of turning against God, he turns to Scripture, and he turns to prayer, and he's saying, I'm going through a really hard thing, but I know that if I turn to God, and if I read the Scriptures, and if I'm doing these things, my soul will delight in them, and those things will be a comfort unto me. And so this can be a really good lesson to us, where if we are face to face with a struggle, and we are having a hard time with something, the Scriptures and God and prayer, those things are going to be the things that comfort us. Those are going to be the things that will get us through those trials. And so I love that. The other thing that I want to talk about from these verses is it shows his, I feel like humanity is the right word here. It shows his humanness, okay? Because it talks about, so it talks in verse 17, it says, my heart sorroweth because of my flesh. My soul grieveth because of mine iniquities. So he's saying right here, I've done some pretty awful stuff, and he's sitting here and he's kind of upset because, you know, I think part of it is he's upset that his father's died, but he's also upset because of things that he's done. He's upset because of his sins. And I have this friend in seminary who always talks about, she's like, Nephi is always portrayed as this, like, perfect person. Like, I wish I could just see, like, some more, like, humanness from him and see that he does have weaknesses and stuff. And so, but here's the thing, if you go looking for those verses, you will find them. You will find when Nephi has weaknesses, and this is one of those verses where you will see that he gets upset. He has sins, and those sins are weighing on his heart, and he feels guilty because of them, and his heart is weighed down. And he says in verse 18, I am encompassed about because of the temptations and the sins which do easily beset me. Beset, is that the right word? Is that how you say it? Beset? We're going to say that's how you say it, okay? So he's very upset here. And I think we can relate that to our lives. We're going to have temptations and we're going to have sins. That is a part of life. But then look how he responds in verse 19. And he says, my heart groaneth because of my sins, but I know in whom I have trusted. And I love that. It says, okay, I know that I'm going to have temptations and I'm going to have sins, and I know that my heart is feeling very heavy right now. But if I trust in him, he will deliver me. As hard as it seems right now, I know I can get through it. And I know I've had experiences like that in my own life where I'm like, okay, this thing is feeling so incredibly hard right now, but I'm going to trust in him. And I know that trusting, but here's the thing that you have to realize, okay, saying that you're going to trust in him does not mean that he's immediately going to take away the sins and then temptations. That's not how it works. And I talked about this, I think it was the last episode where I said, an umbrella does not get like, an umbrella does not take away the rainstorm, but it allows you to get through the rain. It's the same thing, okay? We can be sitting here, like, in our rainstorm. That is, like, the rainstorm is like our temptations and our sins and everything like that, right? We could be sitting in that rainstorm, getting drenched and feeling absolutely hopeless, just like Laman and Lemuel. Or we can turn to Christ. We can trust him. He can be our umbrella, and he will protect us from the rain, and we can sit there dry and safe. That does not mean that the rainstorm is going to go away. We're still going to have problems. We're still going to have temptations. We're still going to have sins. But it allows us to get through that. It allows us to feel peace in our temptations, which I honestly, in my life, I never thought that was possible. I was like, how could you possibly feel peace during your temptations? And then I remember sitting one time and I was just feeling so lost and confused, and I just having such a hard time. And then I remember feeling peace and just feeling so calm. And I was like, okay, this is possible. And I was able to feel that peace because I turned to Christ. And so I just love that lesson right there. And then it also talks in verse 20, it says, my God hath been my support. He hath led me through mine afflictions in the wilderness, and he hath preserved me upon the waters of the great deep, and he hath filled me with his love. And I love that so much. And Nephi's not saying that God went and made everything easy, or that he took away Nephi's problems. But Nephi's saying that God made it possible for him to get through those things. And so it really makes me wonder what would have happened if Laman and Lemuel had responded in the same way. So, yeah, and then it continues in, like, 27, 28, 29, 30, like, all of those verses, like, all the way from 27 through, like, the end of the chapter. It talks a lot more about how, why should I yield to sin because my flesh, blah, 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 blah. We're not going to dive into that. I do really love those verses, and they do go along really well with what we just talked about. But to make the best out of my time, because I only want this to be like 30 minutes, let's go ahead and jump into chapter 5. So, at the beginning of this chapter, Nephi talks a lot about how Laman and Lemuel are trying to kill him, very unsurprisingly. And I just want to stop for a second and talk about them, because it almost breaks my heart a little bit. Because it's like, these two guys, Laman and Lemuel, their father and their mother and their brothers, like, they have constantly tried to bring them unto the light. They have tried to make them live a better life, but they're just stuck, and they're not willing to try anything different. And I can't even imagine how hopeless they must feel. And I can't even imagine how awful their life must be. Like, honestly, if you are so consumed with hate and anger that you are trying to kill your brother, like, I can't even imagine living a life like that. Like, I can think of times in my life where I have been very consumed with some anger, and it's been very hard for me to forgive people, and it has not been an amazing feeling. Now, it wasn't to the point that I wanted to kill that person, but I can imagine taking that anger that I felt and bringing it up to a new level. But it's still crazy to me, like, that they are so filled with that hate and that anger that they're trying to kill their brother. And it also makes me wonder, like, what would have happened if they had turned to the Lord? Like, I think it would have been such a beautiful moment if they had taken that hate and their anger, and if they had just turned that over to God. And that they had just said to Heavenly Father, I'm done being angry. I'm done being upset. Maybe I should listen to Nephi. And they just give that to God. I can't even imagine, like, if they had done that, their burdens, like, I can't imagine just, like, that weight being taken off of them. Because it's true. Anger and hate, that is a weight that stays on you. And so I just think it would have been so amazing for them if they had turned to God, if they had given that to Him. And so in your own life, when you are filled with hate and anger and you're feeling very upset, how can you turn to God? How can you give that to Him and let Him take that burden off of your shoulder of that weight? I mean, that anger and hate. Because here's the thing, he's not going to take away the problem that's causing that hate and anger, but when you're able to take away the hate and the anger out of that situation, it is going to make that situation 10 times better. I promise you that. But just a thought for you. So then after this, Nephi obviously does not want to stay in a situation where he's going to be killed. So he packs up his family and stuff, and they leave. And I love how in verse 11 it says, "And the Lord was with us, and we did prosper exceedingly, for we did sow seed, and we did reap again in abundance, and we began to raise flocks and herds and animals of every kind." But I want to go back to verse 6 real quick, because it talks about how Nephi went to each of his family members and was asking them, like, okay, tonight we gotta, like, sneak out, we gotta go, like, if you're coming, you have to go now. And I had this thought when I was reading this. I was like, would I have been willing to follow Nephi? Or would I have been so scared of Laman and Lemuel that I would have just stayed? I think it took a lot of faith in that moment for his family members to follow him. To be able to, like, if you think about it, Laman and Lemuel have tied Nephi up. They've tried to kill him. Like, they know that Laman and Lemuel could be possible of really crazy things like that. And so it's like, what happens if we run away? Will they follow after us? Will they try and kill us? Like, maybe it's safer in this situation. And then it reminds me of, like, real life scenarios. Like, I can think of several times in my life where I have been in relationships with friends or family members and stuff like that where it has not been a good situation for me. I can think of one friendship in particular where I just didn't want to be part of that anymore because of the way it was affecting me. And so I was like, I'm going to remove myself from the situation. It's not going to change how they will feel about me or how they feel about others for that. But I think it was really smart of Nephi to just say, okay, I'm just going to remove myself from the situation. As scary as it might be, like, who knows? They might chase after us, and that would be really scary. But it's better than staying here. So in your life, when you're in a relationship or a situation that feels very scary, how can you say, okay, yes, it's scary, but it would be scarier to stay than it would be to risk leaving. So yeah, they do end up escaping safely. Laman and Lemuel and those guys, they don't come after them for a while, and they were kept safe. There are so many more like things I could talk about from this chapter because this is a really great chapter. But I'm going to go ahead and end here. So next week we get to talk about what kind of happens after this. And so, like, Jacob will read from Isaiah and talk unto his people. So we're going to learn some really great, like, lessons from Isaiah and that stuff. So make sure that you come back next Monday at 4 p.m. Central Standard Time for that. And I will see you guys then. Bye.